Hi, this is the first in a series of videos in which I'm going to show you my process for going from a mock-up to a actual coded functional website. So this is intended for my Web Design 2 class. If you are just stumbling upon this on YouTube, just know that eventually I hope to make a more polished version of this series and maybe go into a little more detail, a little more background information, and make it more accessible to a broader audience. I apologize for the poor video and audio quality here. I'm just recording in my basement while my baby's asleep. But anyhow, let's take a look at what we're doing here. So we have three versions of a mock-up, three PDFs for mobile, tablet, and desktop. So the first step in this process before you do any coding at all is just to plan what you're going to do. So that starts obviously with just looking at the mock-ups. If Adobe Acrobat will stop being stupid. I lost my desktop. Oh my god. Alright, let me just close this and reopen. Mobile. Come on. Mobile. Tablet. And desktop. The computer's being very slow for some reason. Alright, so we need to look at these mock-ups, and we want to look for anything that's going to be like tricky, that we know we're going to have to like kind of plan for. But mainly we're looking at the overall picture of how this content is organized. What are the big chunks of content? We want to identify those chunks so that we know, we have a sense of how we're going to write our HTML to mark this up. When we're looking for these chunks of content, you want to look for two things primarily. One, what makes sense logically as like a group of content from a user perspective. So for somebody looking at this website, and you need to especially consider accessibility for people who are using a screen reader or some other accessibility software. How is that code going to be read, and how are these chunks of content going to be semantically marked up? So as we're looking at this mock-up, let's look at the mobile first. Some of the obvious like logical groups of information would be the nav bar, the header. We have a group of text here. We have a video and some images, another chunk of text, and then we have this footer area. So from a kind of just semantic content perspective, that's pretty straightforward. So the other thing you need to think about is layout. How will you need to mark this up to be able to actually use CSS to create the layout that we're trying to do. And if we see, if we look at the tablet and the desktop here, we can see that already there's stuff shifting around. We see in the header actually some pretty big changes. In the mobile version, the logo is overlapping with the image, and then this slogan text is stacked beneath that. We switch to tablet, and now this logo and this image are side by side. The image has changed into a circle, and then it's even more different on desktop. Good news is, right now we don't have to worry about all of that. We don't have to think too much about how we're going to do that. It's good to like kind of keep in mind that like that's going to be probably a tricky thing that we're going to have to tackle at some point. But right now we're just thinking about the big picture. And since this group of content, the logo, the image, and the slogan, it all makes sense logically to group that together. And layout-wise, it all stays together. Even though the pieces within it are moving around, they're still all in a chunk that is all within like the same place in the larger layout. We're not like say taking that image and putting it somewhere else entirely on the website. It's all staying together. So we don't have to think about how those are moving around quite yet. Let's look at how the big layout does change. So what I would do here is just actually just kind of sketch this out on a piece of paper. And I don't know how well you can see that, but just sketch out a really basic version of the sections of the website and just label them. So like I said, I would do that, just do that on paper normally, but since we're on a screen, I went ahead and did that in Illustrator. And so here on the left is the mobile, and then tablet, and then desktop. And so these are those big chunks of content, and I've labeled them so that we can see how they move around from layout to layout. So one of the main things is it goes from single column on mobile to 2-column on tablet and 3-column on desktop. So we know we're going to have to do a multi-column layout here, going from 2 to 3 columns. And we know that that's fairly easy to do with grid. So not a big deal there. The other thing to notice is that we have some things kind of shifting around in the order. So for mobile we have text 1 and then images. And then on tablet we actually then have the images first. And then the text 1 becomes part of this left column here. The other kind of tricky thing is this logo. So in the in the mobile, the logo is just sitting here on the bottom. Then it becomes part of the left column along with that text. And then it becomes part of the middle column with that text. And if you're looking at the mock-ups, you might initially think that this logo should be grouped with this text here, because it looks like here it's all part of one column, and here on tablet it's all part of one column, this text and this logo. But if we look at the mobile, that text is up here and then the logo is all the way down here. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where like with the header, you know, all that content is sticking together. It's not like we're not taking that image out and putting it somewhere else entirely. In this case, we are. So this um, this logo and this text, even though they're together for two of the layouts, they are completely separate in the mobile layout. And so that tells us we know that we can't really group those together in the same container. They each need to be their own separate piece so that we can really move them around and reorder them in our grid layout. So when we're marking this up, the next video is going to be about writing your HTML. And this is really going to help us when we're marking this up, because we know that each one of these boxes needs to be an element in our HTML container. And wherever we have our grid, we know that each one of these boxes are going to be the grid items. So the key thing to remember about grid is that only its direct children become grid items, and only its direct children are affected by that grid layout. And so we can kind of figure out right now what our where our grids are going to be. Let me just change my color here. Switch to that and whoops, what am I doing? Unselect that. There we go. Fill. No, stroke. Sorry. Stroke and no fill. There we go. And let's just... Alright. So, we know for the multi-column thing we're going to need a grid. So what needs to be in the grid? Basically anything that is part of this multi-column layout, images, text, this logo, those all need to be grid items so that we can move them around into the different columns. We could just put the whole entire thing in a grid. We don't really need to, though, because the nav, the header, and the footer just they don't move around. They're always kind of just stacking on top. So we could do this. Whoops, undo. We could just make our grid around these elements here. And then the nav, the header, and the footer will just stack. So all of the rest of this will be, oh gosh, come on. Deselect. Change my stroke. So this blue rectangle is like just the normal flow layout where everything stacks on top of each other. So we have the nav, the header, the grid container, and the footer, each as the kind of direct children of the body that are just creating that stack. Then within the grid, we can move stuff around and make the multi-column layout. Semantically, it might actually make sense to just go ahead and it's not the right thing. There we go. Semantically, I think maybe it makes sense to go ahead and include the header as part of that grid container, because that way we can just kind of, this is all kind of the main content of the page, from the header to the logo, I would say, is like the main content. The nav and the footer would be the stuff that's like the same on every page of the website. But the header down to the logo, we could wrap all of that in a main element, and that just semantically makes sense to do that. And then so we can just make that main element the grid container. So yeah, the header doesn't need to be in there necessarily for layout purposes, because it just kind of stays in the same place. But we can go ahead and include it, and it'll just become one of the grid rows, and it won't move. So yeah, all right. So that's it for the planning stages. So the next video will be about writing the HTML.